Hey everybody, Professor Sackett-Taylor here with another video lecture for Principles of Macroeconomics. Now we're getting into the good stuff. This is content from Chapter 8, Price Level and Inflation. So prior to this, we looked at a chapter on unemployment. And we were able to measure the unemployment rate as the percentage of the labor force who would like to work but are currently not working. We also looked at a different measure of economic well-being, which is the labor force participation rate. This is the percent of the overall population that's actively in the labor force. This is another way, another indicator we can use to look at the health of the current macroeconomic conditions. Before that, we examined GDP, gross domestic product, and we saw that there's nominal GDP, which is the market value of all goods and services produced within a given year, within a given country. But it has some issues, and specifically one of the main issues is that it needs to be adjusted for inflation. When we adjust for inflation, which is prices, we get nominal GDP, which is a measure that's a little bit more accurate for the way that we want to use it. We kind of skimmed over this topic of inflation in the past two chapters, and now we're going to go into it more deeply and look at how inflation is calculated, what the problems and causes are associated with inflation. And specifically, we'll look at the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, what it is, how to calculate it. So inflation is a continual rise in the general price level, which is the price of all goods overall in an economy. It is not the associated price of a certain good going up as a result of shifting supply and demand factors. This is price levels overall on average. So by itself, when price levels go up, what it does is it decreases the purchasing power of the money that you hold, because now you'll need more dollars to buy the same thing. So each dollar essentially has less value. It also creates uncertainty, both for firms and for workers, and it may cause changes to consumption patterns or buying patterns due to that uncertainty. Hyperinflation is an extreme version of inflation where we see an extremely high rate. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. It occurs when we see overall price levels falling. Inflation in the United States from 1965 to about 2015 averaged around 4%. This number is high because the average itself is high, because we saw really excessive inflation, maybe even something that would be considered hyperinflation in the 1970s. Inflation peaked at 14% in 1980. But most recently, inflation rates have averaged less than 3%. So how do we get these inflation rates? Well, it's all based on something called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. The Consumer Price Index is the measure of the price level that's based on a bundle of consumption for the quote unquote typical consumer. The purpose of the CPI is to include everything that was purchased by the average consumer in order to estimate essentially the cost of living. It uses a typical consumer. So we're really looking at what the average American buys. Obviously, not all people buy the same goods, especially college students or senior citizens or new parents to young babies. They're probably buying different goods. But what we can do here is apply a weight on certain prices, meaning that some price changes are going to affect consumers more than others. So, for example, if the price of housing was to go up by 20%, that could have a really big impact on families. Whereas if the price of popcorn went up by 20%, the effect of it is not going to be nearly as bad. So we would use a weight to more heavily weight the housing price as being more important, essentially, to the consumer than something like popcorn. This consumer price index is calculated by the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it comes out every month. The weights are going to be based on spending patterns for the average person. What you can see here is that housing, and this includes both rent and mortgages, is the biggest portion of the average consumer's expenditure. But note here that like some of these categories are pretty broad. So like, for example, there's an entire category for transportation and entire category for food and beverages. And like that food and beverages category includes prices for like everything from oranges to potato chips to baking flour. So the weights that are assigned to each different category of expenditure is going to be based on a spending pattern that is pulled out of the data each month of a typical American. So for example, these spending patterns would say that approximately 16%, 17% of our expenditure is on transportation and for about 42% on housing. We can see that our highest expenditures are housing, transportation, food and beverages, and medical care. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the government entity that is tasked with doing these calculations, and they measure and report inflation month to month. The goal is to determine the price, the average price level of all goods and services that a typical consumer buys, and identify how much of the typical consumer's budget is spent on those particular items. So each month, the BLS collects price information, the data based on what is bought and sold in the economy in a given month. And they're using data from over 8,000 different goods and services broken into 211 different categories. And they do this regionally as well. So we're looking at 38 different regions of the United States because prices differ region to region. As we saw in the slide before this, some categories include food, clothing, entertainment, travel, housing, and the geographic locations that they're looking at are regional. So it's like East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, and then they break those areas down, Southeast, they break those areas down into rural and urban areas. And then they estimate based on the data trends, how much each good impacts the typical consumer's budget. So let's get an update right now from the BLS on our August 2021 numbers.
The August CPI number came out on Tuesday morning, and it came out with a bit of a surprise. Instead of a hot number, it came in very tame. Month over month, up 0.3%. The market was looking for up 0.4, and keep in the back of your mind that in July it was up 0.5. So is the Fed right? Are we just seeing transitory impact? Well, the reality of the situation is in certain areas, yes. If you look at used car prices, down sharply. The market has seen its peak. The next thing is airline tickets. And if you look around you, other than energy, most prices have stabilized or slipped a little bit. The core CPI, that's ex energy and food, came in up 4. The market was looking for it up 4.2%. Now, one drop doesn't set necessarily a trend, but it certainly gives the market reason to pause a bit in the idea that the Fed has to move on tapering right away.
So a couple things from this video. They mentioned the Fed. We're going to talk about that in a future chapter, but that's the Federal Reserve Bank. And they were predicting that price levels were going to increase more than they actually did. So, in other words, we actually saw less inflation than what was predicted, and this is a good thing. So you can actually go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and see a breakdown of these categories. Here's a breakdown of the CPI from August 2021. And it's a really cool website. You can see it broken down by category. And then even within those categories, it breaks down further. There's like interactive graphs. Perhaps we'll use this in class together. But we can see that it was really where we saw the greatest increases in prices between July 2021 and August 2021 was in the energy sector. So let's practice what we know. Which of the following spending categories makes up the largest portion of the consumer price index basket? Well, if you remember from a slide earlier, it was housing. People tend to spend 40 to 50% or more of their income on rent and mortgage payments. So how do we actually calculate these numbers? This is a slightly simplified version of what the Fed actually uses, but it's good for our purposes as students. So to calculate the consumer price index, remember what an index is. An index is where we create some kind of spectrum of numbers and we assign a meaning to both ends of that spectrum, the lowest spectrum and the highest end of the spectrum. And then therefore we can deduce meaning for all the numbers in between in a comparison way. So the price index is going to be the overall price of all the items in the basket this year divided by the overall price of all items in the basket in whatever we want the comparison year to be, the base year. So if we wanted to compare things to the year 2020, and look now at the consumer price index, we would look at the basket price now in 2021, divide by the basket price in 2020 and multiply by 100. And that's going to tell us on an index scale how the overall price level compares now to the overall price level in 2020. So then we can use this formula to deduce inflation, because remember, inflation is the change in price level. So if we have two different price indices, we can use a percent change formula to calculate inflation. So it's going to be the price index now, subtract the price index in the base year, divide by the price index in the base year. And this is going to give us a percentage change. This is inflation. So here's an example. Let's consider three goods. Each of them has been given a price and a quantity. And here, cost in this case is the total amount of money expended on that item. So we can see that if our three items are popcorn, Coke, and a movie ticket, then we look at unit prices and then overall what we paid. So if we buy one popcorn at a unit price of $6, our total cost is $6. If we buy two Cokes and a unit price of $5, our total cost is $10. So we're assuming here that what we're calling the basket of goods is one popcorn, two Cokes, and two movie tickets. Okay, so we can see that the total cost of this basket in the base year, which is we're calling 2016, we spent $40 total on all the items in the basket. Let's allow this to be the base year. So that means it'll be assigned a price index of 100 because it's base year over base year times 100. So then we look at how much prices went up between 2016 and 2017. So we calculate how much we spent in 2017 on the same basket of goods. And we can see that in 2017, the same basket of goods cost us $44 to consume. So to determine the price index for 2017, we take the new price of the basket, $44, and divide by the old price of the basket in the base year, $40. And then multiply by 100. And we can see that this gives us a price index of 110. So now if we wanted to deduce what the inflation rate was between 2016 and 2017, we would take the new price index, 110, subtract the old price index, 100, and divide by the old price index, 100. So this is 110 minus 100, which is 10, divided by 100. 10 divided by 100 is 1/10, 0.01, or sorry, 0.1, and then we multiply by 100. So in other words, between 100 and 110, that's a 10% increase. So this is an example of a 10% inflation rate. So in the figure on this slide, we can see the index is set to 100 for the base year of 1982. Given the current level of the consumer price index, we could see that between 1982, the base year, and 2018, where the consumer price index is 251, that means that prices have more than doubled. So the inflation rate associated with this is the percent change in the CPI from year to year. So the higher the inflation rate, the greater, the faster the CPI has increased, right? And so what you notice here is that overall consumer price index climbs and climbs and climbs. So prices tend to go up over time, but the rate at which they go up changes. So in some years, it goes up faster than in others. So some observations to make here about this historical data. On average, inflation is about 4%. Over the past 50 years, we saw inflation was the highest for the decade of the 1970s. Inflation reached its peak at over 14% in April of 1979. Since 1983, inflation has averaged less than 3%. So if we look at average just since the 80s, it's actually lower. Inflation rates were actually negative here during the recession of 2008, 2009, which actually, if we have a negative inflation rate, that's actually deflation. So that means it was a situation in which prices were dropping as a result of the recession. So what we saw in the last figures is basically you can always expect prices to rise over time, especially in travel, education, and healthcare categories. But there are some prices in some categories that actually tend to fall over time. And most of this is in technology. Because as a result of technological advancements, we usually are able to purchase the same technology at cheaper prices over time. So the best example of this is like televisions. So in 1997, like the best television on the market was about $7,000. And then by 2012, the best television on the market was about, $500. And I'm using best here as like on average, the kind of television that would have been like the best kind that you could get. But this is like a really unique market because the quality of the technology is increasing. Another example of this is computers. So in the 1980s, computing operations were talked about in megabytes, but and so during that period of time, so it had very low computing power, but computers were cost anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000, if not more. Today, we're not talking in terabytes in terms of computing power. We're talking about, we're not talking about megabytes, we're talking about terabytes. So much faster computing power. We're even talking about measuring things in gigahertz. So in terms of like the amount of information a computer can hold at a given time. And today, computers are half the price, right? Like a really, really top line computer would cost you $2,500. I'm sure some of you got like a laptop, which is perfectly fine and does all the computing you need it to do for $500. So this is a representation of an increase in the quality of technology that's resulting in a decrease in the price over time. So let's check what we know again. Here, if inflation is the general rise in the price level, why have consumer electronics had prices fall over time? That's because the advances in technology have greatly reduced the production cost. And so the price that they're able to sell those products for has declined. So sometimes it's useful to compare prices over time, right? Like sometimes you might hear like, oh, someone who had $1 million in 1990, like what would that be like today? What, so what we can do is we can take the earlier price and adjust it for differences in price levels. So we're essentially adjusting past price for inflation to see what that price would be in today's dollars. We can then examine the price today to see if the price of the good has generally risen faster or slower than the rate of inflation. So in other words, we're really looking at like, did prices really increase, or did prices just increase at the same rate as inflation for that particular product? So this is really like a unit conversion where the value of the dollar is different in different years, like how far your dollar takes you. You could think about it like that. So there are some concerns that we have about the accuracy of the CPI. Primarily, they fall into two categories: that's substitution bias and changes in quality. And these are going to be broken down in the next few slides. So substitution bias, this is when, this is like a demand shifter, right? The price of a related good. When the price of good A rises and A and B are substitutes, we're going to buy more of product B. And so we don't want that action, I guess, the substitution action, to be conflated with this concept of inflation, because the movement is due to the substitution effect, not due to the price level. And so since 1999, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has actually incorporated a formula that accounts for price changes that are the result of these substitutions in consumption. Same thing with change in quality. So if we don't account for quality changes, then an increase in CPI could look like the price of the same good is increasing, when in fact the good itself is changing. It's gotten better, and that's the reason the price of it has gone up. So it's really not the same good. It's not, you can't compare them if the quality of the good has changed. So the BLS does account for this. This is like the TV example. So they make adjustments, using a very complicated formula, but they make adjustments to, with associated quality changes, so that we're not comparing apples and oranges, right? We're not comparing tube TVs from the 90s with flat screen TVs from the 2000s. Those are actually like two different goods, even though they're both television sets. So there's also concern about new products and the location of these transactions. So for new products, usually prices will drop after a couple years when they're no longer so new. And also the establishment of new retail outlets, especially I'm thinking about like online retailers like Amazon, they're able, because of economies of scale, to offer better prices than traditional retail stores. And so they actually offer lower prices over time. But again, these are different factors at play. This is not an inflation deflation situation. So the BLS is starting to account for these forms of bias in the measurement. All right, so that's where I'm going to end this video. So what we did so far is we looked at consumer price index, how it's calculated, and then how the consumer price index is used to deduce the rate of inflation over time. We looked at historical data trends for the United States for inflation and looked at the CPI indicator for August 2021. In the next half of this video, or the next half of this video series, we're going to look at the effects of inflation, essentially the cost to society as a result of inflation, and break that down into the different categories. So I'll see you in the next video.